I think we worked up to the 6-Day War, and we're going to talk about the 6-Day War. I remember it well. It was probably the height of pride for Jews in America, was this, when Israel won the 6-Day War and got Jerusalem and the wall and all that stuff. So it's just 9:31, so we're going to wait, a few minutes for people to join us. What's happening in Israel, Mike?
It's a good question. Most importantly, we have not yet had our winter rain, which is true. We have, the Bible tells us that there's a Yoreh, the first rain, and we haven't had a winter rain. So we're still, I'm still walking around in shorts in the middle of the day, which coming from LA, I guess for most of you is not that abnormal. The government is still here, which is good. Our corona numbers are down tremendously. And there actually is good news that the government, the cabinet last week approved the corona cabinet, it hasn't officially been authorized yet, a plan to allow tourists into Israel as of November 1st, as long as you fulfill the criterion of having your third booster vaccine, or no more than 180 days, 6 months have passed since your second vaccine. Now, I don't know how many of you are in that situation. Israel has widely received its third vaccine, but most of the rest of the world has not. So it's a bit of a teaser in that we're open, but there aren't a huge, if you want to come, for example, with your kids and your grandkids for their bar or bat mitzvah, they can't come if they're not vaccinated, and your kids probably in their 30s or 40s wouldn't be able to come because they wouldn't have their booster. You might have had your booster. So, but the really good news, I think, as someone in the tourism business who has not worked in tourism for 20 months, is that it's the first time since March of last year that the Israeli government is actually coming up with a plan to return Israeli tourists into Israel, which I think is good. It's a lot of criticism, but I think that's
somebody just asked, what about teenagers and kids? Do they have to have a third booster?
Yep. So if you're under 12, according to this new plan, you cannot come into Israel because you're not vaccinated. Or you can, but I think you have to do a week or 14 days quarantine.
No, but you're right. But if they had it in the last 6 months, they only need 2.
Correct. If a 12 to 17-year-old has had it, absolutely. And there's a good chance that your teenage grandkid might have had the vaccine 2 months ago, right? Their second vaccine. So that's definitely possible.
So kids and teens who have had 2 within the last 6 months do not need a third to get into Israel. Okay.
Correct.
Well, I just had my third.
There you go. I just had my second last week after fighting the doctor, because they're not giving us vaccines for the they're not giving vaccines for people who have had corona, which I had a year ago. But it's interesting because a lot of Europe now, particularly Eastern Europe, has a new wave of people who are catching corona. And, we seem to, since really March of 2020, really be ahead of the curve. What happens here then happens in the rest of the world. We started vaccinating with the already August 1st with the booster, and it's still kind of not full policy in most of the world. And it really helped significantly reduce. We've got less than 1,000 new cases a day, and we're up to, I think, 12 or 15,000 just a month or so ago. So it's drastically reduced, which is good news. Question is this with us forever, like the flu shot? You're going to have to get a new one every single year? Nobody knows.
All right, it's 9:35, so let's begin. Very excited to hear about the 6-Day War and its aftermath. I'm going to turn off my video, and we'll have Q&A when you're done, when Mike is done. Okay.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Shalom you all, as they say in Texas. I know we're not in Texas, but whatever. It's the State of the Union. Why can't I just want to take 2 minutes to review what I've done in the past 2 weeks. And I'm cognizant of the fact that I talked too quickly, so I apologize in advance. And I thank you, Rabbi, for interrupting me last week and saying, Mike, slow down. I've even made a custom sign for myself that I'm looking at. You can't see that says slow down. So I'm going to try to slow down, but don't hesitate to nudge if I talk too quickly. There's a lot in there. Maybe I think, Rabbi, in retrospect, we should have done this as a semester course, but I'm trying to pick out the highlights. The first week we looked really at the precursors of Zionism, are the 1860s, 1880s, the first wave of immigration, Aliyah, founding of the Zionist movement, 1897. And then for the next 50 years, until 1947, UN's partition plan, we talked about, or I explored as you guys didn't do much talking, sorry, I explored the development of the Jewish community in Palestine up until 1948, and we ended week one with Israeli independence. Last week, we talked about what I think was the most incredible 20-year period in Israeli history, the period in which the population tripled within a decade, foreign currency was rationed. There were a number of opportunities of slipping into a civil war, including the story of the Altalena, under the idea of unifying all the military organizations in the nascent state of Israel. We talked about almost having a civil war over the reparations. And we also talked about some of the cracks in Israeli society having to do with the challenges / mistakes of the immigrant, the Aliyah, particularly from Middle Eastern countries. Today, what I want to do is look at the next almost 20 years and look at the Six-Day War. Last week, we talked about the lead up to the Six-Day War and end with the handshake on the, why do I have this? Oh, it's the wrong slide on the right-hand side, I just realized. And with that, the handshake, not the handshake that you see on the right now, but the handshake, similar place, but a different handshake. This is actually part 4, the handshake of the White House lawn with Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel. But just to review my last slide from last week, the lead up to the Six-Day War. Again, don't read everything, just look at the dates. Nasser, president of Egypt, expelled the United Nations force that had been in Sinai since the 1956 war. Israel called up the reservists. A few days later, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran. Both of these actions of Nasser, the president of Egypt, were seen by Israel as acts of war. All sorts of diplomacy to try to end the imminent descent into war. Of course, President Johnson told the Israeli foreign minister it would be unwise to jump the gun. The cabinet has to decide whether to declare war because we're about to be attacked. They end in an undecision or lack of decision on May 27th. And then there's this waiting period during which time the Jordanians joined the Egyptians and the Syrians. Israel formed an emergency national unity government with the political right and with Moshe Dayan as defense minister. And then finally, on the 5th of June, 3 weeks after Nasser's original actions, Israel decides to launch an aerial surprise attack and pretty much destroys all of the Egyptian Air Force while still on the ground. And for those of you like Rabbi Nanis who were in Chicago at the time and saw this headline, Jews, Arabs, War, there was no Instagram or news flashes that one got from the LA Times on your phone back then. This is what we heard in the synagogues. I was too young. I was all of 3 years old then to remember it, but this is what the Jewish people all over the world heard without really knowing for a while what was going on. Two of the main protagonists, there you can see the late King Hussein of Jordan on the left-hand side, and Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, the one who led the Syrian officer coup in 1952, overthrowing King Farouk, who nationalized the Suez Canal, which essentially led to the French-British collusion with Israel on the Suez Crisis in October of 1956. And you see some of the French airplanes that Israel used, the Mirage, in the 1967 surprise attack. And I mean, I'm not in the Air Force. My son is, but he's not a pilot. He's in search and rescue. But Air Forces all over the world to this date still learn about the miraculous, nothing less than that, defeat of how Israel destroyed 374 aircraft from Egypt and Syria and Jordan. And at the beginning, that massive operation that totally caught the Egyptian Air Force by surprise, all of Israel's airplanes except a dozen went to pretty much destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. On a side note, by the way, this week, I mean, just on the news last night, there was an Israeli Air Force, it's called the Blue Flag exercise. The Israeli Air Force together with the, I think, forces from Germany, definitely, and from the United States Air Force, and the head of the Air Force of the United Arab Emirates, amazing, came to Israel yesterday to participate in these, I think, 6 or 7 countries flying their airplanes together in some sort of practice of some sort of, no dogfights, thankfully, but in some sort of practice session. So even the United States and Germany, arguably some of the more significant military forces in the world, still do a lot of training with Israel. And a lot of that, I think, is in the shadow of what happened in 1967. The classic images you, I'm sure, all remember. This is Motagur, the head of the paratroop brigade, overlooking the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives in June of 67. I should say, and read Michael Oren, I'll quote him in just a few minutes' time, but the war in 67 was not a pre-planned act of aggression of Israel. Unfortunately, it's oftentimes seen that way today. But in many ways, I think, and many historians, I believe, including Arab historians, read Fuad Ajami, for example, who came out with a book in the 70s called The Arab Predicament. He's an American Lebanese scholar. And he basically says that, the 67 Six-Day War by Israel was proof of the corruption of the Arab regimes who, rather than focus on their internal issues, focused on their external aggression toward Israel. But there was no plan. In fact, there was debate within the Israeli cabinet over whether or not Israel should take the old city. And they were hesitant. And it only happened on the, not at the beginning, but really on the second, toward the third day of the war. Here we see Yitzhak Rabin, commander-in-chief of the IDF, Moshe Dayan over here, you can see the eye patch, and this is Uzi Narkis, the commander of the Central Command. Right? In Israel, there's a Northern Command, a Central Command, and a Southern Command. And of course, Jerusalem being in the center, Narkis was the commander there. And that famous picture by the late great Israeli photographer David Rubinger of the three paratroopers at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. For 2,000 years, there was no wall which before we could shed tears, as the Israeli poet wrote, Chaim Hefer. And this iconic image, I think, one of many that came out of the Six-Day War, of these young men looking with this look of absolute wonder, incredulity, amazement, miraculous victory at the stones of the Western Wall, which for the first time came under Jewish sovereignty in June of 1967. And here you see the triumvirate of the Commander-in-Chief Rabin, Defense Minister Dayan, and Uzi Narkis walking into the old city through the Damascus Gate. Now, shortly after the capture of the old city, there wasn't a lot of fighting in the old city. Tanks couldn't get in there. There was some artillery barrage, but it was very little weapon fighting actually within the old city. But a group of paratroopers climbed up on the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest sites in Islam. It's also the holiest site in Judaism, because under the Golden Dome of the Rock is where our temple was, and where Abraham, according to Jewish tradition, bound his son Yitzchak in the story of the Akedah, the story of the binding. And paratroopers raised the flag up. You can see there is the dome over there of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And here you can see the Israeli soldiers proudly with the flags of Jordan, and there are the Israeli flags in front of the Dome of the Rock. And a cry went out on the radio, I guess, and the Uzi Narkis, the paratroop commander, said, we have to take that flag down quickly. This euphoria of the first time in 1900, almost 2,000 years, that Jewish sovereignty has been restored to the most sacred real estate in the planet for the Jewish people was, on the one hand, very exciting. Some would say even almost messianic in proportion. But on the other hand, there was a recognition that there was an issue there, in that significant numbers, now probably 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, hold that same piece of real estate to be their third holiest place in the world. And so 10 days after the capture, after the immediate taking down of that Israeli flag on top of the Dome of the Rock, the Israeli defense minister, Moshe Dayan, met with the head of the Waqf, the Muslim religious establishment, gave them the keys to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the status quo since June 17th, 10 days after Israel's capture, 1967, of that area, was that the Muslim religious leadership determined who comes, who has access and who doesn't have access. So it's a hot potato in Israel today. I'm not going to go there, but this euphoria was felt not just in Jerusalem, not just in Israel, but all over the Jewish world. Look, if you look at these two maps, you'll notice on the left-hand side, the green, where Israel was, the size of Israel from the spring of 1949 until June of 1967. The green is Israel. This area I mentioned last week, the West Bank, was annexed by Jordan, including East Jerusalem, the white dot, and Gaza was taken over by Egypt. Look what happens in 6 days. All of the light green, including Sinai, which is about 2.5 times of all of Israel pre-67, and Gaza are captured from Egypt. East Jerusalem and the West Bank is captured from Jordan, and the Golan Heights is captured from Syria. Israel wakes up on the 7th day and realizes that it is now 3 times the size We went from, as it was a week ago, we realized we're no longer the little David, we are now the Goliath. At the same time, there are now 1 million Palestinians under Israeli control in Gaza and the West Bank, and thousands, probably tens if not hundreds of thousands of more Palestinian refugees fled as a result of the Israeli conquest. Listen to what Levi Eshkol, our prime minister, very hesitant in the weeks leading up to the war, creating a lot of anxiety in Israeli society. Listen to what he says shortly after the war. A week ago, the fateful campaign began. The existence of the state of Israel hung in the balance, the hopes of generations and the vision that was realized in our own time. During the fighting, our forces destroyed almost 450 enemy planes and hundreds of tanks. The enemy forces were decisively defeated. Many fled for their lives or were captured. For the first time since the establishment of the state, the threat to our security has been removed. At once, from the Sinai, Gaza, Jerusalem, etc., etc. In other words, incredible. We're not even 20 years old. We've already been through 3 wars, 48's independence, Nakba, the 56 Suez campaign, and now we're about to be wiped off the face of the earth. And there are some of you, I'm sure, listening who remember 54 years ago, there was a palpable sense all over the world that Israel might not survive in 1967. Not only did Israel survive, it went from preparing mass graves in parks in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem to celebrating this unprecedented, almost miraculous victory in less than a week. Already within 2 weeks, the government said to the Arab countries, we'll give Sinai back to Egypt, the Golan to Syria, and we're even willing to enter into negotiations with the West Bank. Unfortunately, I think, back then, the Arab League, the Organization of Arab Countries, met in Khartoum in Sudan, and they said no. The 3 no's of no to negotiation, no to recognition of Israel's right to exist, and no to any peace whatsoever. And in many ways, I think, the question of the future of the conquered, liberated, reunified territories, Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, whatever term we choose to use, that has become one of the, it was for many years, today it's less so, central political divisions between right and left in Israel after 67. And it is the main issue, I think, still dividing right and left, not issues that are right and left issues in America, for example, socialized medicine, right to life, gun control. Those are issues that are, in general, the rule of government, very different in Israel. And what's incredible is that the success, the relative ease of the success, led to this complacency that ultimately became a feeling of overconfidence leading up 6 years later to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So looking at the map of the operations in Sinai, first of all, on the left-hand side, here was the border. This is Israel, the Negev, Eilat over here. It's incredible to think that a country, I can't imagine, I don't know of any other historical example of a country tripling itself in size, fighting 3 wars against 3 neighboring countries in the exact same time, and totally one-sided military victory. The Golan Heights you can see up over here, it just maps of all the directions of the Israeli soldiers. But I think the most important source for us to learn, if you want to do more learning after my session, of course, about this period, is a book by the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, Michael Oren. He wrote a New York Times bestseller called The 6 Days of War. I see Daniel has raised a hand. Daniel, if you could hold on to the question until the end, just make it, I think, easier in terms of trying to remember it. You can even put it in the chat, and the rabbi and I will look at it afterwards. But I don't want to have to interrupt, because then I'll be tempted to interrupt a lot. Michael Oren wrote a book already a number of years ago, and what's amazing about the book is that he had the opportunity to meet, after the peace with Egypt in the 70s, early 80s, and Jordan in 94, with Jordanians and Egyptians, and a lot of first-hand information, intelligence information as well, which had been kept secret from Israelis, all of a sudden was exposed. In a speech he gave about a year ago in a session I participated in, he said, here are some of the very important consequences of the 6-Day War. 1, it gave Israel the land it needed, eventually, a decade later, to make peace with Egypt, that huge buffer of the Sinai Peninsula. 2, it led to a strategic alliance with the United States. We talked in 56 about the end of empire with Britain and France and the Suez crisis. We talked about how soon you'll see the first American sale of weapons to Israel after France stopped selling weapons after 67. And the alliance continues to grow ever since then. And you said this earlier, Rabbi, but there's no question that the Six-Day War transformed our American Jewry, I'm Canadian, North American Jewry, a Soviet Jewry, I think, as well, allowing us to really talk about the Holocaust for the first time publicly, and really giving American Jews the sense of pride, which I think ultimately turned and translated into political power outside of Israel. As I said already, Soviet Jewry gave him this tremendous sense of pride in Jewish identity. Natan Sharansky famously wrote in his biography, he said, it gave us a sense of the Jews imprisoned, not all actually in prison, but behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, that we were part of a bigger picture. And it wasn't just that Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It's that Israel defeated these client states that were supplied with weapons and soldiers by the Soviets. So it was a real harsh blow to the communist world, and it really strengthened the pride of the Jews behind the Iron Curtain. It connected the state of Israel to the land of Israel. What did Oren mean by that? All of a sudden, the biblical heartland that we're reading about as we speak in Genesis, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob take place in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. So there's a deeper connection, not just the modernization of the Jewish people, the new Jew that I spoke about 2 weeks ago, but the biblical heartland is now, for the first time, Hebron, Bethlehem, Shiloh, Beit El, all of these very important, Jericho, are all now under Israeli control. And he said, interestingly, ironically, it was also good for the Palestinians. Last week, I talked how in 1964, the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded. Now, all of a sudden, the Palestinians are on the map. Yasser Arafat, more world recognition. He spoke at the UN with his pistol in the mid-1970s. And as he writes, so these are all from his speech a year ago, but one of the most important conclusions from his book, I think it's the last line of his book, is as follows. If the war was indeed a storm that altered the region's landscape, it was. It also exposed the underlying nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict, its bedrock, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, he means. The modern Middle East created in 1967 was therefore a hybrid, a region of incipient promise, but also of imminent dangers, mixture of old contexts and new. It allows Israel that breathing space after 19, almost 20 years of independence, and it also basically puts the Arab countries in place, realizing that it's very hard, if not impossible, to defeat Israel militarily. But at the same time, it brought much more to the forefront the issue of the Palestinian national movement. These more iconic images of the young Israeli soldier with the Kalashnikov, the Egyptian rifle inside the Suez Canal. And that picture, like the picture of the paratroopers, I think had a very significant role on the identity of North American Jews. And again, I was born in 1964 in Canada. I was too young, but definitely the sense of pride that my parents' generation felt. For the first time, Israel was here to stay. The Jews were no longer just the victims of the Holocaust, but rather they were a strong, proud, and independent country. And as Oren describes again in his book, rarely in modern times has so short and localized a conflict had such prolonged global consequences. Think about that line. It continues to this very day. Seldom has the world's attention been gripped and remained seized by a single event and its ramifications. In a very real sense, for statesmen and diplomats and soldiers, the war has never ended. For historians, it has only just begun. Now, when we look at that line from 1967, as we see Rabbi Goren, the chief rabbi of the army, blowing the shofar at the Western Wall, realize that when one looks at Israel today in college campuses, let's say in UCLA or in Cal State Northridge or wherever, Irvine, that the issue of Israel today and the animosity that Israel feels on college campuses, or toward Israel, I should say, or the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, all of that criticism of Israel is over the, quote, occupation, which happened in 1967 for many people. For other people, the occupation isn't the changing of the map in 1967, but rather the occupation, when we go back to the map, the occupation isn't 1948, isn't 1967, but is 1948. In other words, this green part, Israel 48 to 67, is just as bad, I think, and many people who criticize Israel today as the occupation is. In other words, the fact that Gaza is now controlled by Israel and Egypt. We're not inside it, but it's controlled by us. The West Bank is still largely controlled by Israel. And I think that's the consequence of the 67 war. There's no longer an Arab-Israeli, there's the beginning of the end, I should say, of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But there is the beginning of an understanding that it's not an Arab-Israeli conflict, but that Israel and each of our Arab neighbors have different interests vis-a-vis each other. And then there's another issue of Israel and the Palestinians arguing over that same piece, small little piece of land. What else happens after the Six-Day War? Believe it or not, there's another war. There was the War of Attrition. The US already in 68, end of 68, sends for the first time 50 airplane cells to Israel. Big news. And we've continued, as I say, that political and military alliance much deeper as we speak. But Nasser, president of Egypt, not happy, humiliated. Here he is, the leader of the Arab world, the leader of Arab nationalism, this coup in Egypt, the leader trying to be of the non-aligned movement in the world with Nehru in India and not really succeeding and failing miserably in the 67 war. He says, okay, we don't accept the ceasefire, and we hope that there'll be enough diplomatic pressure that will get Israel to withdraw from Sinai. So he launches this War of Attrition, as the title sounds, over a long time, really from almost 2 years, 69 to 70, along the Suez Canal, basically wearing down or trying to wear down the much smaller Israeli forces with deadly barrages across the Suez Canal. Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, dies in the midst of the war, and Golda Meir, the leader of the number 2 in the Labour Party, becomes prime minister. Later that year, there is a major incident in Jerusalem, most people forget. A young Australian Christian set the Al-Aqsa Mosque on fire. When captured, he said, he asked the police, what are you doing? And he said, and the Muslim world was outraged. They thought, here, example of Israel trying to destroy our third holiest site in Islam. And he said, I believe there will be no peace. There will be no second coming of Christ until all abominations are removed from the Temple Mount. Crazy guy. He, as I said, tried to start World War III. Eventually, by the summer of 70, the ceasefire ended. Ceasefire ended the war. And largely Egypt said enough is enough, because Israeli airplanes, Phantoms, American planes now, went deep into Egyptian territory. Ultimately, the Soviets supplied them with MiG-21s, the most sophisticated Soviet airplane at the time, and SAM, surface-to-air missiles. And unfortunately, both led to heavy loss of life on the Israeli side and damage. And ultimately, not only did it end the War of Attrition, but it led to greater Soviet-American superpower involvement and rivalry inside the Middle East. So France and Britain gone already 56, and now the 67 war, again, in that context, to be seen, I think, as a primary ground for Soviet, American, Eastern, Western, communist, non-communist, whatever, world blocks. What's going on in Israel? You might remember last week I talked about the Wadi Salim protests in Haifa, in the neighborhood of Haifa. The Black Panther movement, taking its name from Stokely Carmichael, I believe, the Black Panther movement in America. Here we have poor spelling, more than my wife's an English teacher, sorry. You can see Black Panther, and then it says, Ad matay yaguru eser nefashot b'cheder ha'panterim. How long will 10 people live per room? Again, that question that was raised already, although the borders were quiet in Israel in 1971, really for the first time since the end of the Six-Day War, more or less, there is this social protest from a group largely in the neighborhoods of Jerusalem, Musrara, kind of not just outside the Damascus Gate, and the Katamonim, if anybody knows that neighborhood, led by this group, mostly young men, like we saw in Haifa last week. Many who dropped out of school, number who had criminal records. The police, they asked for a protest. The police said nope, but they held it anyway. It helped create publicity and raise public awareness about the poverty and the ethnic tensions, which I already spoke about last week. And I think I mentioned this already a week ago. Golda Meir, new prime minister, said that she met some of the leaders, Charlie Biton and a few others, and she said, they're not nice young men. Ultimately, though, although she kind of denied that there was an issue, which I clearly mentioned there was, and there still is, the government created a committee to deal with underprivileged youth, which was a step forward. And I really think that protest in 71, more than the Wadi Salib protest in Haifa, really was a watershed event, to put social issues, economic issues, ethnic internal Israeli issues on the national political agenda. And I think in recent years, actually, that has been an even more significant factor in a large number of people's decision of who to vote for in Israeli elections, more so than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict / tension / solution. So that's 71. 71, 72, again, post-67 war, the PLO and other branches, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the People's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all these organizations, some Marxists, some socialists, some what, all nationalists, not religious Islamic movements. Keep in mind, that doesn't happen until the 1980s around here, but terror from across Lebanon, mostly. In the 70s, PLO was kicked out of Jordan. They settled in southern Lebanon. Dozens of terror incidents coming into southern Israel. Sorry, from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. You might remember 24 people were killed in May of 72 at the airport. It was called the Lod Airport back then because Ben Gurion was still alive, and so they only named the neighborhood after Ben Gurion posthumously. A terror group, they fly into Israel, they take out their suitcases, and in their suitcases are machine guns and grenades, and they kill 24 people. But what you all remember, I'm sure, is watching live on ABC Sports, the broadcast of the Munich Olympics on September 5th, September 4th, actually, I think it began, where 11 Israeli athletes, there they are, were murdered by a group, Black September, a group within the PLO that had formed after the organization was kicked out of Lebanon by King Hussein. They settled in southern Lebanon from Jordan, and they captured the Israeli athletes. They were in a process of negotiation. They had them in helicopters. They were going to evacuate them to another Air Force base, and there they were going to set them free and set the hostages free. Unfortunately, there was a botched rescue attempt by the German police that ended in the terrorists killing all of the 11 Israeli athletes. Unfortunately, though, 2 months later, the 3 surviving terrorists were released by the Germans as they had hijacked another airplane, and that was the quid pro quo that they had in order to release those hostages. So the tragedy, of course, is the Munich Olympics continued. And for the first time in the Olympics now in Tokyo this past summer, they publicly acknowledged at the beginning, the opening ceremony, a moment of silence, a minute of silence for the 11 Israeli athletes slain in Munich. All right. 67, the war, 70, lots of late 60s, early 70s, new developments. But then the Yom Kippur War, which again, I vaguely remember as a 9-year-old, really was something that got out of hand. In other words, the Egyptian president, Nasser, dies, Sadat takes over, and he publicly declares he's willing to sacrifice 1 million of his soldiers to regain lost territory. Why? It's not that there's a lot of oil there, but humiliation more than anything else, to restore the status of Egypt as the leader in the Arab world, as a great Arab nation. We want what we think is legitimately ours back. Kissinger, I think he's still alive, asked one of Sadat's advisors if he was willing to agree to peace in return for Sinai, and the Americans never got a response from Sadat. At the same time, the Israeli military intelligence said there was a low probability of an attack from Syria and Egypt. And in meetings on October 3rd, the defense minister told the prime minister, Mayer, that the Syrian Egyptian troop concentrations were unusual. They were amassing troops on the borders. They were unusual, but they were probably exercises. War wasn't imminent, they believed. The next day, the head of military intelligence said that hostilities could begin without any warning, but the commander-in-chief, David El-Azhar, disagreed. The same day, they received information from an Egyptian source, Nasser's son-in-law, Nasser's daughter's husband, crazy, that Egypt was going to attack the next afternoon. And so the commander-in-chief of the IDF, David El-Azhar, on Friday, the evening of Yom Kippur, October 5th, put the IDF on the highest level of alert and ordered a limited mobilization of reservists. Now, keep in mind, in 1973, the majority of the military were people beyond mandatory military conscription age, 30s, 40s, 50s, early 50s even, who could be called up in times of war, as we saw in 67 in the lead up to the 1967 war, but not a full calling up of the reservists. That next day, Shabbat, October 6th, the day of Yom Kippur, Golda announces on the news. And you have to realize, in Israel on Yom Kippur, everything shuts down. TV doesn't work. Radio is off. No cars on the road, silence. Whether you're in synagogue or not, one day a year, the airport shuts down for 25 hours. Citizens of Israel, our prime minister said, today at around 2 p.m., the Egyptian and Syrian armies launched an attack against Israel. They carried out a series of Air Force, Armored Corps, and artillery assaults in the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, described the severity of the situation to a group of newspaper editors 2 days later, and he said the situation might lead to the destruction of the third temple, and thankfully, a ceasefire came already on October 22nd. It took a while until the spring of 74 for Israel to sign an agreement, and about the same time with the Egyptians, but you'll notice in this complicated map on the right-hand side, how the border was drawn in 1974. This was Israel before the war, 67. This was Israel up to the purple by the 73 war. And Israeli forces got all the way further into Syria, very close to Damascus, about 20 miles away over here. And Israel ultimately relinquished control of this territory, including the purple, which was given back as part of the disengagement. Egypt, on the other hand, and the agreement after the 73 war, you can see these red spots in Sinai. They got pretty much control of all of the border, all of the Suez Canal on the Israeli side of the Sinai Peninsula. That was 1974, ending that war. Some of the pictures you might remember of the Israeli soldiers crossing the Suez Canal under the command of Ariel Sharon, surrounding one of the Egyptian armies, which ultimately led to the ceasefire. You can see David Elazar, the commander-in-chief, on the right-hand side. The American airlift of weapons to Israel, largely as a response to the Soviet airlift to the Syrians and to the Egyptians. And here you see Defense Minister Dayan and wounded Ariel Sharon, the general who basically ordered this crossing of the Suez Canal and the surprise surrounding of thousands, tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers. The defense minister Dan and Elazar, and of course, the commander and the commander-in-chief, Golda Meir, our prime minister. Look, the war was a tragedy in Israel. Almost 3,000 soldiers were killed, 8,000 injured. It is still seen as a traumatic scar within Israel. And unfortunately, largely is to do with the fact that the political and military leadership were prisoners to this idea that the Arab countries wouldn't dare attack us. I mean, look, we defeated 3 armies in a week. Why are they going to attack us now? It makes no sense. There's no chance. Forget it. Very cocky attitude. The government established a commission, the Al-Granat Commission. There is the Justice Al-Granat over there and some public figures. And ultimately, they decided the following in their conclusion. The Israeli army chiefs had held the conception that Egypt wouldn't attack Israel without sufficient air power to attack in depth, deep in Israel, and to dislocate the Israeli Air Force, and that Syria would not attack without Egypt. Well, guess what? They were wrong, deadly wrong. They published its findings in 74, the main culprit being David Elazar, there he is, Dado, the commander-in-chief, recommended his termination. Others were blamed, but the political echelons didn't take any direct responsibility from this commission. However, David Elazar, he was told to command. Golda Meir resigned shortly thereafter. Dan wasn't found responsible because, quote, as long as he accepts the opinions of his advisors, he doesn't bear any personal responsibility. It really, really was a traumatic event. And there are still people alive in Israel who are still suffering the post-traumatic stress disorder from the 1973 war. What were the major, or some, I should say, of the major consequences? Look, I already mentioned Nixon, who, as Californians you know quite well, was not a big fan of the Jewish people or the state of Israel, but he within 7 days, this massive airlift of supply in response to the Soviet air supply. There were elections held at the end of December. They weren't delayed. Golda Meir's party went from 56 to 51 seats. She was still prime minister. She resigned the next year. That's out of 120 seats. So they still were in government, but were weakened. And according to somebody asked me in the first week, the history of Israel, Martin Gilbert, one of my favorite sources, he said the following. It revealed a growing Israeli diplomatic, military, and economic dependence on the US, which continues to this very day, even if we are having, as we speak, disagreements over what to do vis-a-vis Iran. Third world, largely African, some in Asia, but mostly African countries broke off diplomatic relations with Israel because of Soviet pressure. The war had this psychological breakthrough that eventually led to the Egyptian-Israeli peace on both Israeli and Egyptian sides. We all remember the price of oil going up 300% as the seven sisters, the seven biggest oil producing companies in the world, all of a sudden had their profits increase tremendously, and ultimately led to the huge rise of power of this organization of the oil exporting, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which we all know. We all remember, Sheikh Yamani, whatever his name was, in the 1970s. And it, of course, it had profound internal political consequences. It shook the foundation of Israel with great reverberations, including 3 years later, the fall of the Labour Party in the 1977 elections. So 67 comes along, massive watershed, trebling of size of Israel, more Palestinians under Israeli control. But that division of what to do over that conquered, liberated territory grows deeper. And in 1974, a settlement movement called the Gush Emunim, the Block of the Faithful, formed to increase Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria. Where is it over there? There's a picture of them settling in this place called Sebastia, in the heart of the northern part of the West Bank, Samaria. After the seventh forcible removal by the government, which ordered the soldiers to remove them, they created a permanent settlement, which ultimately became the model for future settlements to this very day. Remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about Tel Chai in 1920, and I talked about the stockade and tower operations in the 30s and 40s in response to Arab violence. And I made a connection between settlements and security / peace / still continues in Israel today. More terror incidents, including the horrible crime of the murder of almost 24 Israeli school children in Ma'alot. We all remember in 74. And then in 75, the United Nations passed this horrible resolution condemning or equating Zionism with racism. It was demonstrably ripped, you can see here, by Chaim Herzog, our ambassador to the UN at the time. Interesting man, son of the chief rabbi of Ireland and then of Palestine. He rose in the Labour Party, became the president of Israel, and now it's his son, Bougie, Isaac Herzog, actually, who is the president of Israel, young, he's 60. That was his father. And in the same year, a year later, I should say, there was a very important, oftentimes overlooked event within Israel of Land Day. The Israeli government confiscated about 25,000 acres of Arab-owned land in the Galilee, not West Bank or Gaza, but Israeli Arabs. And in this protest, a few, I think 6 or 7, maybe even 8, protesters were killed. And every single year on March 30th, there is a Israeli Arab march commemorating Land Day, where the Israeli government confiscated their land in order to build communities for Jews in the Galilee. Carmiel, for example, the town up there is built on largely the land that was taken in Land Day. We all remember July 4th, 1976, of course. That was the day of the bicentennial of America, we remember. But as a young kid at a Zionist summer camp, I remember distinctly, I was in Canada. So we were excited by July 4th, but not as excited as Entebbe. A airplane was hijacked, Air France airplane was hijacked on the way from Israel to Europe, diverted to Libya, from there went to Uganda. And in Operation Yonatan, the Israel Defense Forces and the most elite unit, the Sayeret Matkal, the reconnaissance unit of the commander-in-chief, went and rescued over 100 hostages. 2 were killed, Israeli hostages, in the crossfire. One woman, Dora Bloch, was ill before the event and was taken to hospital, disappeared, nobody knows her fate. And unfortunately, the commander, Yonatan Netanyahu, the lieutenant colonel, here he is in the picture in the Mercedes, was killed in the fire as well. The elder brother of our former prime minister, Netanyahu. But in many ways, this event kind of helped restore this sense of self-confidence and daring do, I should say, that Israelis had after 67, that we lost a lot of after 73, and of course in the helplessness in the era of dealing with terror. Later that year, on Friday afternoon, Israel took delivery of F-15 airplanes from the United States, but the ceremony ended after the Shabbat began. And Yitzhak Rabin, who had taken over from Golda Meir after she resigned in 1974 as prime minister, Rabin had some members of Orthodox parties, not ultra, in his cabinet. And the Orthodox members were very upset. The agreement was that no official state functions would take place on Shabbat. And here was a ceremony ending when Shabbat began. So they had to leave early. They voted a vote of non-confidence in the government of which they were members. But the vote failed. Instead, what happened? Rabin said, listen, you're not going to be part of my government anymore. And during the election campaign that Rabin called, there was a discovery by a journalist of a foreign currency account left by the wife of the prime minister, Leah Rabin, in the United States while he was ambassador, and ultimately went to elections. He withdrew and Shimon Peres took over, and Menachem Begin was later elected in 77. But before that happened, perhaps the most significant event I'm going to talk about in today's presentation is the victory of the Israeli professional basketball team Maccabi Tel Aviv over Moscow, and later winning the European Basketball Championship in April 1977. And the quote by this American-born captain of Maccabi Tel Aviv, Tal Brody, said, "We are on the map. We are staying on the map, not just in sports, in everything." As Olsi Perry, an American who moves to Israel and converts to Judaism, it really was this heroic event. And I decided to put on a short little video of this moment. The first person you're going to see in this video, by the way, is a man named Bill Walton. Those who are not sports fans, Bill Walton, one of the greatest basketball players ever, formerly of the Portland Trail Blazers, in a movie made specifically about this miraculous sporting victory of the total underdog Maccabi Tel Aviv. Remember, it's 77. We've just defeated or survived two major wars with Soviet client states in the previous decade.
He is easily one of the greatest sporting accomplishments ever. All that excitement, all that pride, it just came out of my heart.
This guy, he said something that was in our heart.
That was Tal Brody. He said something that was in our heart. The idea
It is easily one of
the idea that we're on the map. We're on the map professionally, not just, we're not just on the map in terms of wars, we're here. And this tiny little country is able to beat the greatest team in Europe, CSKA Moscow. It was pretty incredible. I remember as a kid coming here in 77, very important watershed, and I wanted to see the trophy displayed in the Maccabi office in Tel Aviv. That same year, Israel introduced the Merkava tank. We're now, I think, heading toward Mark V, the best tank in the world, as a response to the need to protect ourselves, continuing. Fortunately or not, but we don't export the tank, but it's a very significant addition to the Israeli security system. And as I mentioned earlier, after the most contested election campaign in Israel's history, the political right, which had been in opposition since 1949, led by Menachem Begin, storms to victory. And I think when we look at the numbers, you'll realize it's less a victory of Begin's party, the Likud, which was an amalgam of, I think, two or three other parties, with his party and two others. They went from 39 to 43 seats, again, out of a Knesset of 120 seats. But the Labor Party alignment went from 51 to 32 seats. So I think it's more of a loss of the Labor Party than a victory of the Likud party. A new party led by Yigal Yadin, the archaeologist, former soldier, got 15 seats. And this upheaval, or revolution, as it's called, is referred to politically as the Yom Kippur of the Labor Party and the Yom Kippur War. It marked the end of its continuous political hegemony, really since even before the state led by Ben Gurion. One of the first actions, incredible, of Menachem Begin in June was to grant asylum to 66 Vietnamese boat people who came to Israeli cargo vessels out in Asia, I think in the Asian Sea, in the Indian Ocean, I don't know exactly where. And Begin defended the action in the Knesset. He said, people said, why? What are you thinking with Vietnamese boat people? That's not our problem. And he said, listen, the world closed its doors to us, Jews, in the Holocaust. We will do whatever we can to help people in need. There are just literally a handful, I think, of those people who are still here 40 years later. And perhaps the most important event in that year was my bar mitzvah on August 22nd. Okay, granted, Sadat's decision to come to Israel in November was perhaps even more important. And I remember as a kid going home end of August after spending the summer in Israel, and Israel was still licking the wounds from the 73 war. We met people who fought in that war, still traumatized. And next thing we know, Sadat gets on the plane and comes to Jerusalem. So a couple short little videos from 77. It's in Hebrew, but let's look at Chaim Yavin. There was only one TV station in the country at the time. His announcing of the Mapach, the revolution that happened in the upsetting victory, the upset of the Likud party over the Labour Party in 1977.
ערב טוב ושלום רב. לפני 3 דקות ננעלו הקלפיות ברחבי הארץ, ובשעה זו מתחילה ספירת הקולות, קולות שיקבעו את דמותה של הכנסת הבאה, הכנסת התשיעית.
So it's in Hebrew. I don't expect you to know all of the Hebrew, but I want you to see his face and his very stoic reaction. Because remember, most of the elites, including the journalists, I believe, were in total shock of what happened when the votes were counted.
מאבק בחירות בין חצי שנה מן הקשים שידעה ישראל מעודה מגיע לסיומו, ובעוד שעות ספורות נדע את תוצאותיו, מי זכה בו ומי הפסיד. שוב, תחזית בלבד ולא מוסמכת, תחזית המנבאת ניצחון ברור למחל על פני המערך. כן, כנראה לא פחות מאשר מהפכה חלה בישראל, עלייתו של מחל למקום ראשון, סיום ההגמוניה של תנועת הפועלים מזה שנים רבות. נחל המערך.
He said the end of the hegemony of the Labour Party for many, many, many years. Totally in shock, because I don't think most political pundits actually believed it. As I said, later on that year, I came and I had my bar mitzvah, my family at the Western Wall. Oh, sorry, that isn't me. That's not me. It's somebody else. Who is that? Oh, it's the Pope. I put that up there because when popes come to Israel, and the last 3 have been here, and they go and they pray at the Western Wall, it's a pretty big thing. But that wasn't my bar mitzvah. Here's a better picture of me. There I am. Kitei said that's me putting on the tefillin. That's me and my older brother walking in a really hot summer day. And, it's amazing that I had my bar mitzvah at the wall, and my parsha, my Torah portion was from Deuteronomy, Kitei, and the opening line in Hebrew is Kitei lemilchama. When you go out to war against your field against your enemies, and the Lord God delivers them to your power and you take some of them captive. It's basically the rules of warfare. And little did I think when I was a 13-year-old pisher, pardon my use of Yiddish there, that I would eventually have kids. I have kids, all of whom served in the IDF, 2 of whom, my eldest son in the Special Forces of the Paratroop Brigade, and my youngest who's in the Air Force Search and Rescue, swearing their oath of allegiance at the Western Wall where I had my bar mitzvah. Crazy. I'm still waiting to write the book, but it'll be a bit of time. And then, of course, the historic landing of President Sadat in Egypt. Take 2 minutes to reminisce over what most of us, myself included, remember on that November day.
It was an event so unbelievable.
Sorry, make it.
One of the main players thought it could be a hoax. 40 years later, it is still viewed as a turning point for the region. On November 19, 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat landed at Lod Airport outside of Tel Aviv, the first by an Arab leader to Israel. The speech he gave at the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is to this day credited with changing the geopolitics of the entire Middle East, opening the path for peace between Israel and its neighbors, and shaping a new agenda of political relations. Amazingly, the trip had been arranged less than 1 week earlier and would come about in the most public of ways. The United States was fruitlessly trying to arrange a peace conference in Switzerland when Sadat told American anchor Walter Cronkite that he'd like to head to Israel to address the parliament directly.
I'm just waiting for the proper invitation.
If you get that formal invitation, how soon are you prepared to go?
Really, I'm looking forward to fulfill this visit in the earliest time possible.
Later that same day, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin told Cronkite on live TV that the invitation was there, and he'd personally go to meet Sadat at the airport. No back-channel talks, no diplomatic cables, everything out there for the world to see and hear. Begin would address the Egyptian people over the air.
There is no reason whatsoever for hostility between our peoples. In ancient times, Egypt and Eretz Israel were allies, real friends and allies against the common enemy from the north. Yes, indeed, many changes have taken place since those days, but perhaps the intrinsic basis for friendship and mutual help remains unaltered.
Some in Begin's camp, though, thought it was too good to be true. Process that lasted 16 months before a peace treaty brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter was eventually signed by Begin and Sadat on the White House lawn in March of 1979.
So we remember the November visit of Sadat. We remember the handshake. What is that going over next one? Yeah, no.
It was an event.
Sorry about that. Very historic. It took a while. Keep in mind, I'll catch up within the last few slides until they actually signed the peace agreement, of course, but the process. And to think that the country that Israel had fought in 1948 and 1967, 48, 56, 67, the 69, 71 War of Attrition, the 73 Yom Kippur War. In other words, by the time 1977, Israel isn't even 30 years old, it already fought 5 wars with Egypt. And Sadat gets on the plane and says, that's it. No more war, let's make peace. And Israel gave up lock, stock, and oil barrel of the entire Sinai Peninsula. I guarantee you, if you would have been in Israel and asked anybody a month before Sadat declared he was going to go to Israel, hey, what do you think? Are you serious? It's just going to be another war. It's just a matter of time. Incredible how a great leader made a great, and paid ultimately with his life. In 1981, when he was killed by the Muslim Brotherhood, but made a great leap of faith. In the meantime, in Israel, the terror continued. And in many ways, I think the Palestinian terror saw itself as being neglected by the Arab countries, right? Sadat's coming to shake hands with Begin in Jerusalem, but what about the Palestinian refugees? Hello? And so the terrorists continue their actions. 36 were killed, Israelis were killed on a bus on the coastal highway. You might remember, some of you, March of 1978. In response, Israel decided to launch an operation into southern Lebanon, as far as the Litani River, in order to get rid of the PLO terror bases. It angered the Egyptians, who we were having discussions with, right, over peace, and Israel withdrew less than a week later. The United Nations set up an interim force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, as a peacekeeping mission, not to stand in front of Israelis and Palestinians shooting at each other, but to kind of monitor the rules. And the idea was to uphold UN resolutions and to confirm Israeli withdrawal, but still, they would not be the ones holding security in Lebanon. It would be the Lebanese army, which unfortunately wasn't as strong as the PLO. The mandate of the UNIFIL has been adjusted twice since 1978. One in 82 after Operation Peace for the Galilee, which we'll meet next week. And the other after the Israeli withdrawal in Lebanon, we'll also meet next week in 2000. Following the 06 Lebanese war, the UN enhanced the UNIFIL, increased the number of soldiers, and decided that in addition to the original mandate, it would monitor the cessation of hostilities between us and in this case, Hezbollah, and extend the UN's assistance to help ensure humanitarian access to civilian populations, et cetera, et cetera. They really don't do too much there. And unfortunately, this interim force has been there for 43 years. An interim force in Lebanon, probably one of the most permanent forces in the Middle East. Unfortunately today, Lebanon, and I'm not going to go into Lebanon now, maybe in another session I will, but Lebanon has its own tsuras, as they say in Arabic, in this part of the world. It's a state that isn't really functioning well. Last year, they had this horrible accident in the Lebanese port, destroying much of downtown Beirut, hundreds of people killed, thousands injured, in the middle of a commission of inquiry a year later, and they're shooting in the streets. Shiite militias, Hezbollah and Amal, are shooting at Christians. It's really chaotic, unfortunately, tragically. Here where the UN is based, there is Israel, there is Lebanon in pink, and there are the different foreign forces with their flags. Doesn't matter. I think 15,000 in number today. But notice the UNIFIL. There's the UN vehicle, and there you'll notice UN soldiers in the blue flag, and right next to them is Hassan Nasrallah. He's not the prime minister or president of Lebanon. He's the head of the Shia fundamentalist terror organization we'll meet next week in depth, who is supported exclusively by Iran. And here you see the UN protecting the border. That's Israel on the right. This is Lebanon, and you see the yellow flags. That's the flags of Hezbollah, with some sort of provocation in close proximity to the border with Lebanon. That's happening, Lebanon, at the same time that we have, thank you, Merle is leaving early. That is happening at the same time that Israel and the Egyptians are having talks. And so they reached an agreement, the Camp David Accords, in September of 1978. And these are quotes that are taken from Ezer Weitzman, who at the time was the foreign minister, a member of Begin's government. And he says that Sadat, quote, wished to extricate himself from the Russian bear hug, I love this line, and replace it with the American caress. American diplomacy is a little bit softer, perhaps, than the Russians. The talks broke down. Weitzman, this is Weitzman over here, nephew of our first president, by the way, and Dayan broke down. American President Carter invited them to come to Camp David. Stay there until you reach an agreement. After almost 2 weeks there, Israel agreed to return the Sinai to Egypt and remove all Jewish settlers. The first time Israel made that agreement, as well as an interim period of Palestinian autonomy before a permanent solution. That was Egypt's way of saying to the Palestinians, listen, we're putting you on the agenda, you're there. 5 years, there'll be an answer, there'll be a solution. Begin didn't like this. He didn't want to recognize that there was a legitimate existence, even of the Palestinian right to self-expression or Palestinian nation. This was what was called the Framework of Peace in the Middle East, which was signed in Washington on the 26th of March. Ezer Weitzman sums it up and he says, I think in describing both Sadat and Begin, but maybe even more Sadat, he says the following: the greatness of leaders, and I think this is universal, powerful for the foreign minister to say this, is measured by their ability to free themselves of past slogans and outdated opinions and understand the historical currents. This was the greatness of Sadat, Begin, and Carter as it manifested itself at Camp David. Think of your American presidents in the 19th century. Think of President Lincoln, for example. Think of his Gettysburg Address, his determination to unify the country, his Emancipation Proclamation, really going against the grain of much of his society. And I think that that is something that great leaders universally is really a sign, I should say, of great leaders. And the fact that Sadat over here was willing to cross the Rubicon, that Begin was willing to cross the Rubicon as well and give up this massive piece of territory, the Sinai Peninsula, that was a major security buffer against our largest and most dangerous and most powerful and strongest military nemesis, Egypt. Give up access to the Suez Canal, give up the oil fields there, give up the massive space of Air Force bases in Sinai, and Israel agreed to do it. You might remember watching on TV the ceremony, March 26, 1979, Egypt and Israel signed formal treaty extending a state of war, ending a state of war after 30 years. Sadat and Begin praised Carter's role, and ultimately Israel agreed to withdraw from all of Sinai within 3 years. Peace and normalization between the two countries. By the way, just last week, Egypt Air announced for the first time that they're going to have flights to Israel, 1979 to 2021, by the way. El Al flies there, but not them to us yet. Free passage of Israeli vessels through the Suez Canal, unless a tanker gets stuck in it, as it did a few months ago. And after that, the negotiations for Palestinian autonomy would begin. Now, Begin stalled. He didn't really want to advance Palestinian autonomy talks because he knew that would lead to possible Israeli compromise vis-a-vis Gaza. He didn't care that much about Gaza, but even more importantly about Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which you recall, as I mentioned earlier, one of the consequences of the Six-Day War pointed out by Michael Oren was the connection between the Jewish people and the Jewish land, the biblical heartland of the West Bank / Judea and Samaria, where the Genesis narrative ostensibly takes place, now is under Israeli control. So I end in 1979, and we will pick up next week, starting in, I guess, 1980, the year after that. So please, Rabbi, if you are there, if not, I can look at the.
Of course, I'm here.
I know, I video, I can see your face now. Okay.
I have one question, and then of course so first of all, when you present it, it's overwhelming how many times Israel has been attacked and how many wars the people have gone through. And this is like 2 generations of just war and war and war. But I'm just curious, the land day, how did the government justify taking that land in the Galilee away from the Arabs who lived there? How did they? Or was it just a land grab? What was it?
It was a land grab, but it's not the only time it happened. In 1948, Israel becomes a state. Now, there is land that is purchased, right? The Zionist organization is founded in 1897. The JNF is established in 1901, and they buy land. You know, Tel Aviv is a city built on land purchased. Now, who do they buy the land from? Arab landowners, mostly wealthy, many of whom didn't even live in Palestine. They lived in Damascus or Beirut or wherever else. But in 1948, what happens? The government assumes control of enemy property, confiscates property of Arabs who ran away, were kicked out, fled in 1948. So a significant amount of Israeli land in general is land that was taken over by the Israeli government that had formerly been under Arab control in 1948. Fast forward to 1976, the government decided it wanted to create more Jewish communities up in the Galilee, a lot of open land that wasn't land that was used for, and people didn't live in the land. There might have been some agricultural fields there, but it was largely available land that the government said, listen, as in 1948, we have to develop new communities. Where do we want to develop new communities? And so it decided to take the land from the Israeli Arab population.
Were they living there, or was it abandoned land?
No, it wasn't abandoned, Rabbi. I mean, it wasn't places where Arab houses were then taken down. It was either open land or a land that was used agriculturally, mostly olive orchards in the Galilee. But you know, government, in a sense, it's the same but different because there's a lot of politics involved. Of what is it called, eminent domain, and the government says we're going to expand a highway. So the government said we want to develop new communities. Where are we going to do it? And so even today, and I'm not sure if I'm going to talk about this later on, but even today there's an issue with the Israeli Bedouin, right? 9.3 million Israelis, 2 million Arabs, and of the 2 million Arabs, about 250, 300,000 are Bedouin, mostly in the Negev. And the Bedouin Negev, the Bedouin in the Negev, they don't, a lot of them from generations lived as shepherds,
right,
in non-permanent houses, in tents. And they would go, and they were kind of grazing areas that different tribes of Bedouin would have.
right.
And a lot of their control is not written down. There's no deed or title to a particular piece of land. And one of the biggest tensions within Israel now, and even within the current very wide government, which is made up, including of one Arab party, is over the issue of recognition of Bedouin villages in the Negev. Because there's 7 towns that Israel created in the 60s to take Bedouin from scattered all over the place and put them into towns with running water and schools and electricity and medical clinics. And about a third of the Bedouin don't live in those towns. They live in their tents and their huts, and they want the government to recognize those as legitimate towns. The government says, listen, we're not going to go to every 2 tents and put a water main or to put a electric line in there. We'll build 2 or 3 new settlements, move into them, but they don't want to do that. It's a hot issue. In fact, on my phone, I got a message just before my session that the Israeli government decided to recognize an Arab village in the Galilee called Marav, 26,000 people, as a city, which has different municipal, the kind of different, I guess, financial consequences, status consequences vis-a-vis the national government. It's an Arab village. But then I saw that the mayor of the town says, that's not good enough. We have an industrial area, but there's not a single factory there. We want the government to prioritize putting factories there. So it's still an issue in terms of land and control of who lives where, even amongst the citizens of Israel. I'm not even talking about the hot potato and the complexity of Israeli control and building settlements in the West Bank, which is a real whole different kettle of fish.
We don't have any questions, so I have another question. Do most secular Israelis, I mean, I know the Orthodox have their view. I mean, you keep referring to the West Bank as Samaria and, do they recognize that the biblical narrative gives them the right to occupy that based on secular Israeli?
Well, I like to say that everything in Israel is divided into 3. So in the military, they say, there's 3, this, 3, that, everything's in 3s. And even Christianity, I think, adopted that. They have the Trinity, right? I'm kidding, but they do have the Trinity. But in Israel, if you look at the number of Jews who live in the West Bank, and some of you might have read the New York Times yesterday or today, this whole article, I'm not a big fan of the article. The first paragraph kind of discloses the bias of the journalist, but whatever. But it's an article, they talk about 700,000 settlers. And the number, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. There are about 500,000 Jews, 450,000 maybe, who live in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. There are an additional 250,000 Jews who live in Jerusalem in areas that were under Jordan 48 to 67. They're not going anywhere, those guys in Jerusalem, right? So I don't consider them settlers because it's a non-starter for 95% of Israelis. But the 450,000 Jews who live in the West Bank, I think, can be divided into three groups. About a third of them are ultra-Orthodox, maybe even more now, who live in literally a handful of communities, one about 5 miles from where I sit, Upper Modi'in, total Haredi ultra-Orthodox communities, and generally very close to the pre-67 border. They live there because it's significantly cheaper than to live in Jerusalem or in Bnei Brak outside of Tel Aviv. That's a third. A second third are quality of lifers. You want to buy a small apartment in my town, Modi'in, halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I'm talking small, 1,100 square feet, third story walk up, get $600,000 together. If you want to buy the same size house in the West Bank, 5 miles from where I am, you can cut that price in half or even a third. Why? Because the biggest cost of real estate is the land. Government offers the land because it wants to encourage people to live there at various times. So those are people who live in the West Bank because it's much cheaper. Quality of life, cost of living. And about a third of them are ideological, mostly modern Orthodox Jews who live in the biblical heartland. And so for them, living there is about fulfilling, the bond, the connection between us and the land of Israel. So you've got about a third of the Jews who live in the West Bank, West Bank, East Bank, whatever, Bible, non-Bible, they're there because of convenience. Not the ultra-Orthodox and not the ideological settlers. If you ask Israelis who don't live in the West Bank what they think, it totally runs the gamut. From those who think it's illegitimate, it's an occupation, we shouldn't be there, let the Palestinians have their independent state, the others saying, hey, we want it fair and square. There were a bunch of wars. There never was a Palestinian national entity anyway. Jordan annexed the West Bank. Nobody said anything about the Jordanians. We took it. We won it fair and square. I mean, if we put a state in the West Bank, it's going to be like Gaza. They'll be shooting rockets at us and at the airport. So Israelis are all over the place. But I think only in 74, maybe this is where you're looking at, Rabbi, but only in 74 when Gush Ammonim was founded, did the kind of religious excitement over the war really begin to have significant influence. And I think that politically, there are a significant number of politicians in the Knesset today who represent that voice of, this is our land, it's in the Bible, God gave it to us, that is the highest priority. There are others who say,
so ridiculous. It's like what would we feel the Native Americans said, we have a right to Chicago because that Chicago is an Indian name, that we were there like not 4,000 years ago or 3,000 or 2,000, but like 500 years ago. So
not to mention California. Oh, sorry.
California, exactly. So I just wonder if forward-thinking Israelis can justify that, in my opinion, not very valid argument. But
look, I mean, without giving my opinion, I will say that the best answer to that question, Rabbi, I think, is a book, because that's what Jews do. We answer questions with other questions. And it's a book by Micha Goodman, who is a fellow at the Hartman Institute. It's called Catch 67. And in that book, a la Joseph Heller's Catch 22.
Right.
If you've read Joseph Heller, many of you probably have, you remember that this guy's in a situation, there's no way out.
There's no way out.
And it's the same with Israel. And Goodman, who lives, by the way, in a very moderate settlement in the West Bank, says the following. He said about 70% of Israelis agree with this statement. Continued occupation of the West Bank is dangerous to us as a state, morally, politically, etc., if you want to have a Jewish democratic state. So we cannot continue the occupation. 70% of Israelis agree with that statement. At the same time, he says, about 70% of Israelis say, we can't leave Judea and Samaria. If we leave the West Bank, from a security point of view, it means the end of Israel. Because the highlands, where I'm sitting to you, I can literally see the West Bank, the lights in the West Bank. I'm a mile away from the West Bank. So if that becomes an independent state of Palestine, from a security point of view, where I live, and the airport 10 miles in that direction becomes possibly closed down twice a week because of rockets or stones even thrown from the West Bank. And so here's the dilemma that he says. 70% of Israelis say it is detrimental to the future of the state of Israel to continue the occupation, and 70% say it is detrimental to Israel.
Give it up.
So what do we do? That's the Catch 67 dilemma. And I will say, and you'll see this in 2 or 3 weeks' time when I get to the last session, that a lot of the recent Israeli elections are not over the two-state solution.
Right.
This is one of the big issues, I think, between Israeli and North American Jews. North Americans are like, the center left are like, you guys, you got to give up the occupation. And the right is like, is the minority in American Jews, and they're not really talking about that. But within Israel, very few people are talking about it.
Yeah.
It's a crazy reality.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting, as usual. I learned so much, and I feel like I'm one of the better informed people, and I wasn't at all. So I look forward to next week when we will continue our history of Israel and Zionism, and have a beautiful week. And we'll see you and everybody else next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, 1979 to 1998. Keep in mind.
Okay. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye. See ya.